K-On! Is my favorite anime series of all time, and there's no quick answer as to why. I like to tell people it's because the show is dense, which is another way of saying that I'll be talking for 2 hours before I can get to the heart of the matter, but considering I've dedicated that much time to breaking down my least favorite anime ever, it's probably good for my health that I do the same for my most favorite as well. It's difficult to simply explain the appeal of K-On! Because so much of that appeal has to do with the personal relationship which the viewer forms with the show along its run. K-On! Is a show that progressively gets better the more of it you watch, not only in the sense that Season 2 is a lot better than Season 1, but in that Season 1 is more enjoyable if you've already seen the show in its entirety. The most popular misconception about K-On! Is that it lacks a narrative, and that could not be further from the truth. On a moment-to-moment basis, K-On! Is mostly a comedy show about 5 girls and their friends having fun and cracking jokes, but there's a very clear narrative arc across the entire series and tons of growth on the part of every character, which is all stuff that you can only appreciate by watching the series all the way through. While it may seem like one at first, K-On! Is not an episodic series. It is a sequence of events with a logical progression which reaches an eventual conclusion, and as such should be considered a cohesive work in the same way that one might consider a film or a book. Following this logic, I think the best way to explain what makes the series great is to start from the beginning. What I love about the first episode of K-On! Is that you cannot possibly understand the full appeal of K-On! Just by watching the first episode. You do, however, get a taste of the basics. It's a cute little show full of cute little marshmallowy girls with a light color palette, light music, which is the name of the show, and a relaxed sense of pacing. Even the voice acting, by a cast whom at the time was comprised totally of new actresses, is pretty on point right from the start. Often overlooked about this episode and the series on the whole is the incredible attention to detail. Yui's room looks like a real room that Yui really lives in. It tells a story all on its own about what kind of person she is and what kind of life she has. Most of the locations in K-On! Were directly based on real places, such as the school, the real-world equivalent of which has become a tourist location thanks to the show. Because of all these details, the world feels real, alive, and storied. It's easy to buy into the kayfabe of K-On! When I'm watching it, I don't think of it as a story which someone wrote, or a cartoon which a team of people made. It feels like it's actually unfolding before my eyes. That may be a bit of an exaggeration, but my point is that seeing characters who wear outfits that I could see real girls wearing, or seeing a room that looks like the character was the one who made it look that way, creates a deep sense of immersion, which is what allows me to buy into the idea that these characters really exist inside of this world. But anyways, returning to what I said before, while there's a lot to like about K-On! Right from the beginning, it is nonetheless impossible to understand the full appeal of the series at this point, and that is completely intentional. As viewers, our experience of this episode is equivalent to what Yui experiences in signing up for the Light Music Club. We are not really sure if we want to get involved with something like this, or if it fits our self-image. We don't know any of these characters or have much of a reason to care, so we're just kinda shy around them. Remember, by the end of the first episode, Yui still has no idea what the Light Music Club is really like and is kind of ready to bail on the whole thing. Even if we do enjoy this episode right off the bat, it's important that we share Yui's lack of understanding of how this situation is going to play out or who these characters are, because the narrative of Season 1 is dependent on Yui learning about these people and finding a place within this group. That's not to say that Yui is necessarily an audience stand-in or even necessarily the main character, as I think it's equally important that we discover her true nature as the season goes along, but the experience of getting to know these characters and how they interact with one another is itself the narrative of K-On! That's why I said before that the appeal is dependent on the relationship which the viewer develops with the show. It's only through experiencing firsthand how all of these characters form their relationships with one another that we can completely understand those relationships, and it's because of that experience that the later episodes feel so emotional and meaningful. We don't learn very much about any of the main characters in episode 1, and next to nothing about how they interact with one another. At most, we can tell that Mio and Ritsu are longtime friends, and that Ritsu is more headstrong and energetic, but also a bit of a troublemaker whom Mio has to rein in, even as she gets dragged along in Ritsu's plans. We vaguely understand that Tsumugi comes from a very different background and perspective through her mannerisms, the fact that she's never eaten fast food before, and her suggestion that they bribe a student by buying them a car or a summer home. Yui, meanwhile, is clumsy, dense, and empty of thought. She's never had anything to do with herself, so she spends her off time laying around, but now that she's in high school, she feels guilty and wants to do something. Each of these characters has a unique reason for joining the Light Music Club. Ritsu wants to form a rock band because she was inspired by a concert she saw on TV. Mio gets dragged along because of Ritsu's persistence and the fact that she promised she would form a band years ago. Mugi joins because she admires Ritsu and Mio's relationship, and Yui joins because she expects the club activity to be easy. What's important to realize about all of this is that none of these motivations are what keep this club going in the long run. Not only will each of these characters change in personality personality as the series goes along, but form a much stronger attachment to their places in this club, to the point that their original intentions have nothing to do with why any of them are there anymore. This whole sense of not knowing who these people are, how they interact, or what the Light Music Club really is, all comes through in their first performance. None of their parts sync up very well, with Ritsu rushing on drums and Mugi and Mio being slightly out of time with one another. It's clear that they each have some talent at their instruments, but they don't sound like they've learned how one another plays or developed any chemistry. Plus, obviously, they don't even have all of their members yet. This song represents the current state of both the club and the show itself, a state in which each disparate element shows potential, but nothing is yet cohesive or noteworthy. Episode 2 is where the true appeal of K-On! Begins to bleed through, and the series starts to make its intentions clear. It opens with Yui sharing her observations of each of the other club members so far. We learn that Mio is extremely shy and sensitive, Ritsu is kind of shallow, and Tsumugi is wealthy to the point of abnormality. In this opening scene, Ritsu, Mio, and Tsumugi kind of walk on eggshells around Yui because they want to keep her placated. They offer her sweets anytime they come close to offending her, and are desperate to appease her whims to keep her going. In the following scenes, we also learn more of just how airheaded Yui is and how she relies on others, such as her sister, to get by. As we jump into the episode's midsection, the dynamic of these characters slowly begins to shift. It starts when the girls are on their way to the music store, but Yui gets distracted and they end up messing around in various stores along the way. This is the first time the girls get to hang out with no pretenses regarding club activity, and we get our first hints of how each of them would react and interact when put into various situations. However, it's during the scene in which the girls work as traffic surveyors that the show really starts putting effort into both distinguishing and unifying them as characters. When Yui and Mugi are paired up, we see how Mugi is capable of hyper-concentration, while Yui is easily bored. Ritsu gets lost in the rhythm of her car counter, and Mio starts thinking about the time signatures of the beat Ritsu is playing before she tells Ritsu to do her job correctly. When Mugi and Mio are together, both of them are working hard, while Ritsu and Yui are slacking off. At the end, all of them are afflicted with some level of occupational illness. Something K-On! Does better than any other show I've seen is making all of the characters feel at once distinct from one another, yet never making me question the idea that all of them are friends. Each 2x2 pairing of the characters works on its own, and they also work as one group. They experience things similarly enough that they all feel the same way, even though they interact with things in such different capacities. By the end of this episode, we start to develop a sense of what a Ritsu and Yui scene or a Mugi and Yui scene might feel like, and how they compare with one another. We also first begin to sense the passions of these characters. Mugi, we learn, has been playing piano since she was 4 years old and is sort of naturally talented at it. As the show goes on, we'll see how Mugi is perhaps the character who most uses music as a means to the ends of hanging out with the other girls as opposed to a real passion. On the other hand, we see how Mio spent a long period of deliberation deciding which bass guitar she wanted, and how Ritsu fought to be able to afford her used drum kit. We get the sense that these two really care about music, whereas Yui doesn't even seem to understand how a guitar and the concept of music are correlated. Her first reaction to buying one of the nicest and most famous guitars in existence is to pose in the mirror, practice signing autographs, and take it to bed with her. There are other takeaways from this episode as well, like how between Ritsu's bargaining scene and the fact that she not only knows how to job hunt, but at one point is filling out contest forms to try and win a guitar, gives us the sense that she might come from a lower income household, putting her in the opposite position of Tsumugi, whose father turns out to own the music store. Most important to this episode, however, is the way the dynamic changes between Yui and the rest of the group towards the end. As Yui realizes how much work everyone is putting in on her behalf, she recognizes how selfish she's been and decides to buy a cheaper guitar so that she can start practicing as soon as possible. Ultimately, Yui doesn't have to make that sacrifice since Mugi gets her a discount on the guitar she wants, but the lesson sticks. The last scene utilizes a clever reincorporation in which Ritsu offends Yui and then Mugi offers her a snack to placate her, but Yui then expresses her newfound drive to be a real member of the club, thus unifying them at last. Having heard that, you might be thinking, wow, K-On! Had meaningful character development and clever writing tricks such as unforeseen reincorporation as early as episode 2, so why do so many people say that there's no plot in K-On! Well, that's the funny thing about it. K-On! Is really subtle about its progression. Yui doesn't directly explain that she's been selfish, nor does anyone point out at the end the change in Yui's reaction to being offered sweets. It's something you have to pick up on yourself, and most of the people who wrote off K-On! As being a show about nothing would not notice these kinds of subtleties. K-On! Is a show that a lot of people judged by its cover at the time that it came out. Most people expected it to be Lucky Star 2.0 because it was once again based on a 4-panel comic about high school girls and once again was being animated by Kyoto Animation. This was also at a time when shows about groups of high school girls sitting around doing nothing were becoming more and more frequent, and a lot of anime fans didn't like that. K-On! Was lumped in with every other show that had similar elements, and the things which set it apart weren't readily apparent from the beginning. The kinds of people who were ready to write off K-On! As a moe blob show weren't going going to notice the subtleties, and in fairness, I didn't notice them at the time either. I'd wager that even a lot of fans of K-On! Liked it on the basis of it being a cute show without really noticing the subtleties themselves. Remember, K-On! Is a show that gets better the more of it you watch, and I don't think I've spoken to anyone who expected it to get as good as it does in Season 2 from as early a point as Episode 2. Episode 3 is where the humor and characterization of the series finally begins to calcify. Yui is shown to be a lot more confident and friendly in her interactions, making lots of physical contact and cracking jokes, sometimes even at Ritsu's expense. Ritsu, meanwhile, seems out to prove herself as an A-plus comedic character scene after scene. At first glance, this episode seems like a one-off story, and might leave the impression that K-On! Really is an episodic series, but once again, it's a case in which you can appreciate the relevance of the episode more when you know where the series is going. The point of this episode is to establish Yui as a sort of idiot savant. We see that she can learn guitar chords with impressive speed, but at the cost of losing out on her studies. With an upcoming midterm exam, her friends help her to focus on said studies, and in the end she earns a perfect score on the exam, only to forget all of the guitar chords. When this episode came out, some people considered it unrealistic that Yui scored 100% on the test, but that was kind of the point. Yui is not a normal person. She has an incredible capacity for memorization, but is only capable of applying it to one subject at a time. This episode further develops Yui's younger sister Ui and her best friend Nodoka-chan, and we get the sense that Yui has been getting by in life through a combination of being surrounded by far more responsible people and having this incredible talent for memorization. After all, there had to be a reason she was able to make it into the same high school as the other girls, so it wouldn't be surprising if Yui had pulled scores like this out of her ass before with Nodoka's help. Yui's talent for memorization is not just a one-off joke, but an important part of her character going forward. By the time she learns to play notes on her guitar, we'll discover that Yui has perfect pitch, which in combination with her memorization skills makes her able to play pretty much anything she hears, which is going to be important later. Are Yui's incredible powers of memorization and perfect pitch normal attributes for people to have? Of course not. But they are real things that real people can do in rare cases, and Yui is portrayed perfectly as one such case. These aspects of her characters aren't just being played up for a quick laugh, but are definitive parts of her nature, which we'll get to know as the series progresses. In the interest of keeping this post from getting too repetitive, from here on out I'm going to focus just on the broad strokes of what each episode brings to the table. You can pretty much take it for granted that every episode from here on out is going to deepen the relationships between the main characters, flesh out their chemistry and comedy as a group, and subtly teach us new things about their personalities. By now, I should have given you the tools to watch this series with a more open mind and detect what kind of subtleties it employs just by watching it and paying attention. Mostly what I want to do from here on out is to chronicle how the story progresses from episode to episode, not only in the interest of proving the narrative significance of each episode, but to eventually show how the ending is the most logical place at which the story could arrive given all that came before. The thematic purpose of episode 4 is to express Mio's frustration at the realization that the Light Music Club isn't capable of performing at the level of the club that came before, but then ultimately to come to the realization that spending time with the other girls is an enriching experience in itself. Once again, this is not expressed verbally, but instead through imagery and tone. All throughout the episode, Mio is trying to force the other girls to work with her, but is continually dragged into their insistent dicking around. Only after she sees Yui backlit by fireworks does she realize just how much she values the time spent with these friends, and ultimately decides to play for them the song which had inspired this trip in the first place. All of this is massively important because it sets the tone for what this series is really about. K-On! Is the story of how each of these girls finds their place in the Light Music Club, more so than it is about the actual performance of light music, and it's crucial that the one character who takes herself seriously and would stop to question what she's doing with her life is the first to completely understand this. K-On! Is incredibly slow-paced, but that's because the series is meant to reflect the pacing of actual human life. Anyone who's been in a band when they were in high school knows that progress moves incredibly slowly, and for most people it ends up being more of a pretense to hang out with friends than anything else. I would know. I spent the last 2 years of high school and a year or two in college trying to establish a band with some of my musically talented friends, and nothing ever gelled out of it. We'd set out with the intentions of practicing or songwriting and end up watching movies or just singing along to other music instead. It's not so much that K-On! Doesn't take its musical elements seriously, as it is that the story K-On! Wants to tell is of how these band members come together on a human level, more so than on the level of what they may or may not accomplish musically. It's the story of Hokago Tea Time the people, not Hokago Tea Time the band, a hyper-detailed behind-the-music documentary as opposed to the story of how their album came together. Anyways, I'll get into all of this more later, but for now let's move on to the next episode. Episode 5 mostly serves to push the plot forward as we approach the club's first performance at the cultural festival. They find an advisor in Sawako-sensei, the image-obsessed and legitimately skilled guitarist of the Light Music Club 8 years prior. Most of Sawako's development doesn't come until season 2, but for now she serves as the first person to take a critical critical eye to the group's performance as a band, as well as to start properly whipping them into shape. She takes Yui away for personal training and improves her skills massively, which brings our group up to a speed that may yet be ready for the real performance. In episode 6, we get our first glimpse of where K-On! Is really going, and for the first time, all of the tiny moving parts cohere into something whole. Whereas the series up to this point has been characterized by punctuations of high-quality animation in between bouts of decent to mediocre character art, this episode is more consistently on point, with more on-model and high-detail shots as well as much more background details thanks to the cultural festival. I'd also say that by this point, the show's masterful comedic timing is pretty much down pat, though I really could have said the same about the last 2 episodes. This also gives me the opportunity to comment on the voice acting, which is one of the most crucial elements of what puts this show on top of my favorites list, but also the hardest to talk about. Not only is it difficult to describe what makes a good vocal performance, especially when a lot of it has to do with what sounds pleasant to the individual, but my Japanese comprehension is lackluster at best, so I feel awkward about commenting on a Japanese performance. Nonetheless, I do believe that the voice work in K-On! Is top-notch, and in particular, Toyosaki Aki's performance of Hirasawa Yui and Sato Satomi's performance of Tai Nakaritsu are my favorites in all of anime. What makes these performances stand out to me is the level of versatility which each actress brings to their role. In real life, people's voices tend not to sound exactly the same all of the time, especially people who like to crack jokes. People throw their voice or morph it when they're around different people or when saying certain things and conveying certain tones, and Sato and Toyosaki both nail that versatility in their acting perfectly. Consider that both of these actresses are not just performing a variety of voices, but doing so while maintaining their characters. When Ritsu does the sumo voice, it's not just Sato doing a sumo voice, but Sato doing Ritsu's voice doing a sumo voice.
お相撲さん、お相撲さん。稽古は本場所のごとく、本場所は稽古のごとくっす。相撲は国技じゃないっす。格闘技っす。相撲に勝って勝負に負けるとはこういうことかいな。あ、どすこい、どすこい。あ、どすこい、どすこい。
I chose this episode in particular to talk about the voice acting because throughout the entire episode, Yui's voice has been wrecked from her training with Sawa-chan sensei, and Toyosaki nails it the whole way through, even when she's doing backup vocals during the live show. At the start of the club's performance, we get a sense that these characters have already come a long way, especially Mio, who is capable of singing on stage with these friends at her back, and Yui, who's progressed as a guitarist enough to perform at all. In lieu of actually watching the concert, we're given a cool little music video which uses hypersaturated images and iconography to convey a certain 90s MTV look. This scene was most likely handled this way so that the last concert at the end of the season would have more impact, but luckily it gives me the opportunity to talk about the ending theme. K-On!'s ending theme is absolutely legendary, and for good reason. I mean, look at it. It's a legit music video, a high quality one at that, with music that kicks enough ass to justify it. This wasn't necessarily the first ending theme in anime to go for a music video look, but it was far and away the best, and the costume designs alone were enough to make it hugely popular. My favorite part is the listless size of the character, as they seem to deliberately avoid eye contact with the camera and look into space. It's stylish, fashionable in a high fashion sense, and pumped up with enough pop appeal to make it a real classic in its own right. After the performance, Mio trips over an amp cord and accidentally exposes her panties to the audience. In any other show, this would probably have been played up for fan service, but K-On! Deliberately subverts that expectation by turning it into a joke, and that leads us perfectly into a discussion on the fan service in K-On!, or rather, the lack thereof. When K-On! Was first released, a lot of the conversation surrounding the show painted it as a moe blob show aimed squarely at otaku, most likely a young adult male audience, and that assessment was totally fair at the time. The original manga was written by a man and published in a magazine aimed at young adult males. Kyoto Animation had at this point most famously been responsible for The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, which had tons of fan service, and Lucky Star, which, while light on fan service, was very clearly geared towards otaku audiences. They had also produced anime adaptations of Air and Canon, which, while not overtly fan servicey in the anime versions, were originally visual novels with sexual content in them. Given all this evidence, there was no reason to think that K-On! Wouldn't be aimed at a young adult male otaku audience, so it wasn't surprising when a lot of the early writing about the series went out of its way to try and describe it as a moe blob fan service show. However, I firmly believe that this is a case in which hindsight and context change everything. For one thing, the minute you divorce yourself from the mode of thinking that K-On! Is aimed at otaku audiences, it becomes clear that K-On! Doesn't have any fan service at all. It's a super adorable show for sure, but there's nothing about it that seems geared towards men specifically or any kind of sexualization whatsoever. You could say that it's trying to be moe with all of its cute cute moments, but I'd wager that pretty much anyone who likes cute things would have an easy time getting into K-On! You could show this series to literally anyone, and I doubt they would find any of the content to be objectionable, except for maybe Sawa-chan Sensei's actions, which are more or less supposed to be objectionable. The proof is right there in the pudding. Whether or not K-On! Was deliberately aimed at young adult men, the series was a huge success outside of that demographic. I've heard a friend who worked as a middle school teacher in Japan talk about how his female students recognized the characters from keychains that he carried around, and I've seen dozens, if not hundreds, of female K-On! Cosplayers at Otakon and in YouTube videos over the years, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the girls in K-On! Are portrayed realistically. You might be thinking, bullshit, those do not look like real girls, their faces are weird, and they're made of marshmallows, what are you talking about? But hear me out. For starters, the girls in K-On! Are a little bit thicker than what you might expect from anime characters, and they aren't all the same thickness either. Tsumugi and Nodoka are clearly portrayed as thicker than the other girls, whereas Mio is on all accounts described by characters within the show as abnormally beautiful. If you're like me and you hate it when everyone in a show describes one character as beautiful even though all of the characters are clearly attractive, then you'll appreciate the fact that in this show, Mio is legitimately the only one who's classically pretty. Moreover, let's look at the outfits. First off, in most shots, the skirts on the school uniforms actually appear to go past the characters' fingers, which is regulation length in Japanese schools and incredibly rare in anime. The outfits that the characters wear on stage or in the ending theme are very cute, and I mean that in the way that a girl would describe an outfit she's about to buy as very cute, and not in the way that an otaku is describing something he wants on a Dakimakura cover. The outfits are legit cute in this show, from the street clothes to the pajamas, and what's more, the characters themselves find one another and their outfits to be cute. Yes, there are scenes at the beach in which the characters all wear two-piece swimsuits, and guess what? When real girls go to the beach, they also wear two-piece swimsuits, preferably cute ones like the ones these characters wear. What I'm saying is that at no point do the characters wear any outfits which you wouldn't be able to imagine a real high school girl wearing, or which appear to exist for the gratification of a male audience. There are moments in K-On! Which could be taken as fan service, such as this one shot in which Mio's breasts are shown as well defined, but the reason for this shot is that Yui and Ritsu are noticing Mio's impressive bust size, which is not an abnormal thing for a close friend to comment on. It is because of this scene that I would now like to go into full hipster journalist mode and make up a bunch of phrases in order to define the different kinds of fan service as I see them. Fan service moments can be broken down into two broad categories: diegetic and non-diegetic. Non-diegetic refers to fan service that has nothing to do with the events that are actually going on in the story and is solely experienced by the audience. For instance, when the camera randomly pans across Shinon's ass in Sword Art Online 2, those shots don't affect the narrative in any way. They are simply the lens through which the narrative is being presented to the viewer. This is arguably the trashiest kind of fan service because it means that a scene which didn't necessarily need to contain any fan service was given some solely in the name of appealing to the audience. Diegetic fan service can then be broken down into two subcategories: immersive and non-immersive. Immersive fan service is when a situation contains fan service simply by way of the nature of the scene. For instance, the scene of Yui and Ritsu pointing out Mio's boobs is completely in line with their characterization and feels natural in the context of the scene, but could still be taken as fan service simply by virtue of the fact that a lot of people are going to enjoy seeing Mio's boobs. Non-immersive fan service, then, is when a show completely breaks away from what would seem to be natural in the context of the scene in order to deliver fan service. This brand of fan service is particularly obnoxious because it cheapens the overall impact of the story when you can tell that a scene exists for no purpose other than for the author to gratify the audience. I would argue that the closest things K-On! Has to this are when Sawa-chan forces the girls into cute outfits, though again, I don't think any of the outfits she makes them wear are explicitly oriented towards male gratification. Now, what I'm about to say could be taken the wrong way, so allow me to clarify up front. I am well aware that a significant number of the raunchiest, most sexually charged anime and manga were created by women, and that some of the same staff who worked on K-On! Were also involved in shows like The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. However, I don't think it's a coincidence that Kyoto Animation is known to have an abnormally high female-to-male ratio of staff members, nor that the director, writer, animation directors, character designer, and a lot of the leading key animators who worked on K-On! Were all women. It's no coincidence either that from this series onwards, Kyoto Animation shows had a tendency towards minimal fan service, with the exception of the man service extravaganza Free. Even the currently running Amagi Brilliant Park, which has a lot of fan service moments written directly into the narrative, seems to be almost ashamed of itself, with some shots that last only a split second or deliberately downplay the amount of service that the scene seems intended to convey. One of the KyoAni staff members has even been quoted as saying that the studio considers it important that they treat their characters with respect as real people, and thus they don't like like to include a lot of fan service in their shows. Yes, K-On! Is a show that is enjoyed by a very large number of young adult male otaku, but I think it's reductive to suggest that the show was made for that audience specifically, or to suggest that that audience only enjoys it as a Moe Blob fanservice show. K-On! Is a series with both a massive number of female staff members as well as a massive number of female fans, which are the cause and effect of the show's deliberate attempt to portray believable, well-rounded female characters with all of the respect that they would deserve as human beings. Anyways, episode 7 mostly serves as a rest period in between arcs with a focus on character interactions, mostly between Ui and Yui. Noteworthy here is that the production values have jumped up once again to a much higher level of consistency. Episode 8 kicks off the second arc of the series, which is a lot more clearly defined than the first one. Not only does this arc serve as the introductory period for the new band member, Azusa, but it presents both the girls and the viewer with a question which will take a few episodes to fully answer. Early on, when the girls are trying to think of ways to appeal to the new freshmen, Tsumugi asks, "What is the appeal of our club?" And no one comes up with anything. It's important to us as viewers that the name of the show and the name of the club are one and the same, since Tsumugi is literally asking, what is the appeal of K-On! Later in the episode, Ui asks Yui the same question, and Yui answers that it's just fun. The fact that this answer comes first, and that it isn't the last answer that we'll be given in the course of this arc, is imperative. On the most basic level, K-On! Is indeed fun. If you asked a lot of the show's fans what the appeal is, they'll probably give you the exact same answer, and that's fine. But the show is as interested in diving a little bit deeper into that as I am. What episode 8 mostly serves to show us is how strange and insular the Light Music Club has gotten to be over the course of the first year of its existence. The personality quirks which the 4 girls and their teacher all take for granted end up alienating the new freshmen, who see them as a weird and incomprehensible little clique. And they're basically right to think that. It would be incredibly hard to break into a group this tightly knit. But when Azusa sees the group performing on stage, she can feel the raw energy that their togetherness lends to their performance, even if she doesn't understand yet what the cause of that energy is. Episode 9 is our proper introduction to the 5th band member, Nakano Azusa, and mostly takes place from her perspective. Unlike the other girls, Azusa is a serious guitarist who wants to be in a serious band, and most of the episode is about her trying to reconcile the awesome performance that the Light Music Club put on at the freshman welcoming ceremony against the unmotivated idiots that they seem to be. This episode is almost uncomfortable to watch, as it comically plays up all of the characters' worst attributes, and once again, it's doing that on purpose. At this point, we've gotten used to the rhythm of the main group's interactions, but this episode seeks to show us how off-putting and uncomfortable it would be as a newly inducted outsider. We feel Azusa's frustration and anger, not only at the group for slacking off so much, but at herself for admiring them in spite of it all. Azusa makes us feel guilty for having gotten used to the way these characters act, by reminding us how dumb they can really be. Yet along the way, Azusa can't seem to tear herself away from them. She can't even decide whether or not she likes them as people. They seem nice enough, but are ultimately a bunch of disappointments in terms of work ethic. However, she looks at other bands and just doesn't see in them what she saw in the club's performance, so she seeks answers from Mio as the only seemingly sane member of the group. Remember, back in episode 4, Mio was the first one to get frustrated with the club's lack of ambition, and in the end, she was able to realize the value of just having the other girls as friends. It fits perfectly then that Mio would be the one who can best express what the real appeal of K-On! Is. Not necessarily that they are a great band, but that she loves being a part of a band with these members. This ultimately is the appeal of the show, the experience of following the lives and interactions of these specific characters. And once again, I think it's understandable if this appeal does not yet resonate with the audience on a very deep level. We have come far enough to understand the appeal of K-On!, but perhaps not far enough to legitimately feel it. K-On! Is a show that gets better the more of it you watch, and we're only about a fourth of the way through it so far. Consider this like the difference between having read a Wikipedia article on something versus having read all of the sources. We get the basic gist of what makes K-On! Good for now, but we don't really have a full grasp of it yet. Episode 10 puts the girls into yet another training camp scenario, and mostly treads a lot of the same grounds as episodes 4 and 9. It culminates in Azusa essentially learning the same lesson that Mio did before, but more by gradually coming to accept the others as friends instead of being hit by a blunt revelation. You'll notice there's a common trend throughout this series of the characters growing closer in big ways whenever they're taken away from the school setting, and I will talk about that a lot more once we get into season 2. This episode also establishes the beginning of Yui and Azusa's relationship as guitarists who learn from and admire one another, which will also be a bigger deal in season 2. With episode 11, K-On! Is nearly operating at full capacity. Azusa has come to be a fully integrated member of the group, and we get our first big interpersonal conflict that isn't directly related to the club's activities. Ritsu's jealousy and anger towards Mio is portrayed in a unique and interesting fashion, with the nature of the conflict never being stated outright by any of the characters at any point, even when it's over. Everything is communicated by actions and expressions, which is pretty damn cool, but even cooler is the complexity of the problem. There isn't any one direct cause of the conflict, but more of a boiling over from various tensions. Mio and Ritsu are both somewhat stressed over the upcoming concert, and Ritsu, as we learn later, is starting to come down with a fever. Mio gets angry with Ritsu first because Ritsu fails to understand how important the lefty fair is to her, or why she might be upset with Ritsu for dragging her away, especially when Mio has to put up with Ritsu's indulgences all the time. Ritsu seems to know that she's done something wrong, but is too stubborn to admit it. She blames Mio's growing relationship with Nodoka, which is downright selfish considering that Mio just wants to be friends with the one person that she knows in her class. Mio is too angry and Ritsu is too stubborn for either of them to be straight with one another, and since the other girls and their idiot teacher don't really understand the nature of the conflict, they don't know how to intervene. In the end though, when it gets to the point that Ritsu is in bed sick, both of them realize that they've basically just been buckling under stress and stubbornness, and they remind one another that in the end they are still best friends. It's adorable. K-On! Might be the only show that could pull off this conflict without making it too melodramatic, and without having the reconciliation feel too hammy, while still communicating that these characters had a conflict and made up over it in the end. The situation is just complex enough and the characters communicate in realistic enough ways that all of it feels completely natural, and that feeling is one of K-On!'s biggest specialties. Episode 12 is the climax of the first season, and I cannot finish it without bursting into tears. Seriously, I watched it twice leading up to writing this post, and I lost my shit completely both times. It tells of the period leading up to the club's second big cultural festival performance, as well as showing the performance itself. If this series could be said to have been made with a mission statement in mind, then this episode spells out what that statement is. The conflict revolves around the possibility that Yui won't be able to perform on stage because of the cold she picked up from Ritsu at the end of the last episode. At first, this mostly leads to hijinks, as Ui tries to pose as a stand-in for Yui and Yui tries to practice sick, but it becomes more dramatic as the group has to decide whether or not it would be worth it to perform without Yui. Azusa is the most concerned and cries out that it's meaningless for them to go on stage without her, which is particularly powerful when we think back on the arc she's just had. Remember that Azusa was only able to understand the appeal of the light music club when Mio explained that she enjoyed being in this band because it has these members. Azusa has learned to attribute the group's amazing live performances to the fact that they work so well together, and had this idea reinforced in the previous episode when she was watching the last cultural festival performance on DVD. Azusa still hasn't gotten to perform with this group yet, and both her desire to be a part of the magic that she saw on stage at the freshman ceremony, as well as her own desire to perform with this group as a friend, is tearing away at her now. In the end, Yui gets over her cold in time, but ends up having to miss the first song of the performance while she runs home to get her guitar. All throughout this episode, and really the entire season, Ui and Nodoka have been talking about how much Yui can get into something when she really sets her mind to it, and how only now that she's a member of this club has she really been able to put that single-minded tenacity to good use. As Yui leaves the house, the scene from episode 1 in which she tripped and busted her ass is reincorporated, only this time she doesn't fall down, plus she isn't distracted by anything while running down the street like she was before. As Yui makes this run to the soundtrack of her friends' performance, she remembers how scared she was back at the start of the season, that she wouldn't find her place or figure out what to do with her life. She tells her past self not to be afraid because at long last she's found a sense of belonging in the light music club. If Kyoto Animation has one big specialty, it's making emotional scenes through detailed animation and music. When K-On! First came out, a lot of people joked that the series was one big expansion on the famous musical performance from The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. That scene had been famously emotional because of how the visually accurate musicianship, emotional facial expressions, and generally awesome music had culminated into something which felt raw and alive. All throughout its run, whenever K-On! Shows a character playing their instrument, it's always presented with technical accuracy. However, up until this point, we've only seen it in bits and pieces. Performances usually feature frequent cutaways, or are replaced with music videos, or we see the face of the person's hearing the music instead of seeing the performance. Only here at the end of the season do we get lots of uninterrupted shots of the characters performing accurately, growing passionate, breaking into a sweat, and generally exhibiting a whole range of emotions on stage. Yui arrives on the scene in glorious fashion and breaks into tears at the realization of the burden she's been, not because she's ashamed of herself, so much as because she's only now truly realized the gravity of how much she cares about these friends, and how badly she wants to repay everything they've given her. Yui tries emotionally to communicate these feelings to the audience, and despite her odd manner of speaking, she gets the emotions across. She even boldly states that this auditorium right here, this is their Budokan, the pinnacle of what they wanted to reach. Remember, K-On! Isn't a show about Hokago Tea Time the band, but about Hokago Tea Time the people, and for this group, coming together in this place to perform as a unit puts them at the height of interpersonal connection. The second performance of Fua Fua Time is even more emotional than anything before, as we see the girls not only in full force, but images of all the places that brought them here. And when it's over and then everyone starts playing again, we get the incredibly powerful image of the 5 girls all facing one another while they play. Even as they're sharing this feeling with the audience, they're more importantly experiencing it together, and fuck, I'm actually crying just thinking about it. I think I need to go sit down. Episode 13 is somewhat confusing because it's considered an extra episode, even though it aired along with the rest of the season. Once again, the production quality makes a leap in consistency, putting it closer to what the show looks like for most of season 2. Story-wise, this episode takes it slow by separating all of the girls and putting them in casual day-to-day scenarios. Towards the end, some of their days are going downhill, but simply being able to spend time with the others quickly abates all of their worries, showing once again how this group operates best as a unit. The K-On! Livehouse OVA was released with the last disc of Season 1 on Blu-ray and is definitely something special. By invitation of one of Ritsu's friends, the girls get the opportunity to open for a live show. Kyoto Animation definitely went out of their way to make sure that the location and the setup leading up to the performance was as accurate as possible, which I appreciated as someone who's been to a lot of live shows. Each of the bands performing with them is another all-girls group, one in the high school age range and the other more likely in college, but both with a much stronger sense of image and purpose. Meeting these bands and being in this situation is at once frightening and enlightening for the girls, as they get a look at what it means for a band to take themselves seriously and work ambitiously. At first, they feel distant from all of this, like children getting a glimpse at what it means to be adult. However, they gradually develop a sense of kinship with the other bands, and upon realizing how important this live show is to everyone, they try to tighten up their game. Perhaps the most important realization is had by Mio, as she observes that it is only because Yui was willing to talk to the other bands, and because Mugi was willing to offer them tea, that all of them were able to get to know one another. I would add in that Ritsu was able to get them the gig to begin with, and that Mio and Azusa were able to hold this group together with their sense of responsibility all this time. What Mio is realizing isn't just that each of the members of this group contributes something to the whole, but that all of them are turning into better people by way of being around one another. Mio would have never spoken to the other bands on her own, but because of her friends, she gets to experience something valuable and inspirational to her own development as a person. Just by being together, these 5 girls are filling in the blanks in one another's personalities to create more complete persons, all of them progressing handily towards adulthood. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of the first season of K-On! By now, you should have a pretty good grasp of what makes this show appealing and what it's trying to accomplish narratively, and where it may be going from here on out. Knowing all of this, it might not be so surprising to learn that K-On! Was an insanely massive success at the time that it came out. It beat the previous record-setting Blu-ray sales of Bakemonogatari to become the best-selling TV anime of all time in Japan, and the amount of merchandise to come out of the show cannot possibly be overstated. There are few anime out there with more product tie-ins than K-On!, and the impact was far-reaching. While K-On! Wasn't nearly as big of a hit nor as critically acclaimed among Western anime fans, it is nonetheless very popular and well-known, even if it's a lot more divisive here. The first season actually got an English dub by Animax Asia and was broadcast in other Asian countries before it made it to the US and UK and got another dub here. My motivations for making this video have not only been to share my opinion on my favorite anime series of all time, but also to offer some perspective. K-On!'s reputation is so divisive in the Western anime scene that I've talked to some people who think that everyone loves it and some people who think that everyone hates it. I had gotten so used to seeing constant K-On! Love threads on 4chan's anime board over the years that I had honestly forgotten that K-On! Wasn't universally acclaimed, until I started talking about it in my videos and getting a lot of weird looks. I guess what I'm saying is you don't have to take my word for it. K-On! Is widely appreciated around the world, and if you bring it up in most anime communities, you'll see fans pouring out of the woodwork. Even if not all of those fans can easily put into words what makes the show special, I'd like to think that I've helped to explain the appeal in as much detail as possible. But of course, we are not even done yet, not even halfway. There's a 26 episode second season, another OVA, and a movie that I haven't even touched on yet. And as I've been saying again and again, K-On! Is a series that gets better the more of it you watch. But we will get to all of that next time in part 2. In spite of being twice the length of the first season, K-On! Season 2 has a much more cohesive sense of theme and takes place over a much smaller amount of time. Said theme and the overall tone of the season are introduced to us in the first episode. Once again, the production values have made a considerable leap, and in this season, the visuals seem more grounded and realistic than before. Many more shots contain atmospheric lighting on the characters' faces, and there are far fewer super deformed segments, with an emphasis on dry humor over the spastic moments that were more frequent in Season Season 1. Two very important facts are what drives the majority of this season's narrative. Firstly, that the 4 original club members are now seniors, meaning that this is their last year in the Light Music Club. And secondly, that when they all graduate, Azusa is going to be left alone. For now, the girls aren't too concerned about either fact, as they're excited to be seniors as well as content to keep the club the way that it is. But we can already feel the weight of these two facts adding a little bit of pressure to the entire season. When Yui tells Sawachan sensei that they still have 365 days together, it almost feels like a countdown. Azunyan reaffirms the lesson which she and Mio had both learned in the first season, that the point of Hokago Tea Time is to be a band with these members, but the context has shifted a little. Before, it was more of an empowering message used to psych her up about joining the group, but now it's a way for the characters to come to terms with the fact that the club doesn't necessarily need to survive to serve its purpose. We'll comment on this more later on, but for now we see the girls content to keep the group at 5 members. Episode 2 is mostly about throwing the girls into different situations and seeing how each will react, which leads to by far some of the funniest moments in the show up to this point. We've finally gotten to the point where all of the characters and their interactions are solidly defined enough to make them entertaining in just about any scenario, and the spot-on comedic timing of the directing and editing pushes it to the next level. Two things which have become increasingly apparent about this season are that the characters are starting to grow up bit by bit, and also that they're starting to become more passionate about music. This season started off with Yui playing guitar by herself, and as the girls talk about effects pedals and musicianship, we get the impression that they're actually developing the mentality of a real band. It helps that they continue to be put into situations which revolve around music, thereby strengthening the theme of musicianship within the show itself. Likewise, episode 3 is all about Ritsu coming to terms with her self-identity as a drummer. Ritsu isn't capable of putting her attachment to the drums in any certain terms, but Mio is able to do so for her attachment to the bass. Just like Mio, every time I've heard a bass player talk about their instrument, they talk about how the bass lays the foundation of the song and holds all the parts together. And as such, I've always equated the straight man character in any comedy series to being the bass guitar of the group. Towards the episode's end, we see the girls become increasingly self-aware of the importance of performing together and playing the instruments that they do. Ritsu actually says that when they play together, it feels like they're operating as one entity, which is something I once wrote about my favorite band Agaloch in a review of what was once my favorite album, Ashes Against the Grain. The conversation this show is having about the nature of good music is similar to the way that I feel good music when I listen to it, which makes it resonate that much more strongly. Up until this point, I've mostly been analyzing K-On! At the technical level, trying to illustrate what exactly the series is, but it's here that I'm going to break away from that format to talk about why episode 4 of season 2 is where K-On! Starts to engage me more on the personal level. I've mostly kept my personal tastes to myself up until now in the interest of making sure that the largest number of possible viewers can appreciate my points, but from here we'll be diving more into my subjective experience of the show, which not everyone shares. I don't know that K-On! Could be one of my favorite shows without appealing to me on this level, but by now I should have laid enough groundwork to prove that these subjective experiences are far from being the only reasons that I love the series. If you've been checking out my content for a while, then you probably know that I like a lot of shows about the power and importance of friendship, and that's because I hold friendship in high regard in my own life as well. Both online and offline, I have very tightly knit groups of friends who more or less do everything together, similarly to what you might see in a show like K-On! So that portrayal of friendship resonates strongly with me. I'm the type who likes to watch a show and think about how it connects to myself and the people around me, so naturally when I watch something like K-On! It makes me think about my own friends and the bonds that we share. I go on a lot of trips with my friends, from the epic hiking trips that we've taken over the last 2 years to all of the times that they've come with me to Otakon, and those experiences have always been something which we deeply cherished and remembered as special memories. The trip which most reminds me of this K-On! Episode though is when I met up and shared a room with some of my closest online friends at this year's BronyCon. Along with each of my brothers, I shared a hotel room with Drowning in Footwear as well as the 2 best brothers who bitch about ponies. All of us had gotten to be close friends through chatting on Skype all the time, and we stuck together for the majority of the convention, to the point that we actually didn't really attend any panels or see any guests because we were just using the con as an excuse to hang out. I dare say that we hit Baltimore in a fashion very similar to how the Light Music Club hit Kyoto in episode 4. But the moment which resonates best and which had reminded me of K-On! Even while it was happening was after the first night of the con when we were all trying to get to sleep in the hotel room. Everyone just kept cracking jokes and laughing their asses off for hours on end, and just the fact that we were all trying to sleep made pretty much any stupid thing we said into the funniest shit ever. It reminded me of everyone dying every time Ritsu says Share Kobe or Lycopene, and just like in K-On!, a lot of the things that we came up with became inside jokes among our group of friends. I can basically say that I legitimately experienced this exact scene from K-On! With my own friends, and knowing that makes the show feel that much more real and relatable in turn. But it doesn't end there. The Horseshoe Crew also has a youngest member, who happens to be great at guitar and come from a family of musicians. musicians, who didn't get to come to BronyCon because he was too busy helping out other people. When I was rewatching K-On! Recently, the moment Azunyan appeared on screen for the first time, I suddenly remembered that she didn't get to go on the field trip with the other girls, and relating this to Give and Take, I immediately burst into tears. I even got him to watch the show and told him that he was Azunyan, and since he went into it with that mindset, he ended up connecting with her instantly and kept connecting with her throughout the show. Give and Take frequently worries that he might be left behind by the rest of the group, and said that his experience watching episode 5 of season 2 was just like what he'd felt while he was at home during BronyCon. He had fun with his dad and enjoyed what he was doing a lot, but still wished all along that he could have been hanging out with his close friends on one of the few chances he'd likely get to do so anytime soon. The connection between Give and Take and Azunyan is what solidified this whole parallel as something deeply moving for me, which only served to enhance the incredible love that I had for the series already. It's worth mentioning though that while Give and Take is the Azunyan of the Horseshoe Crew and Footwear is more likely the Yui, leaving me somewhere in the Tsumugi range, the relationship between me and my brother Shade is exactly like that of Yui and Azunyan if Azunyan was Ritsu. I don't have anything special to say about episode 6, so I'll take this opportunity to comment on how cool it is that this season has consistent background classmates. It seems that the team knew they'd be setting a lot more scenes in the classroom this season, so they made sure that all of the students had unique character designs and would be seated in the same places in every shot, which is a very cool touch that not a lot of shows bother with. Some of these background characters have even developed their own miniature fandoms. Episode 7 is an interesting one because it doesn't really progress the narrative or character development, but feels like a kind of bizarre side story. It's a blatant parody of hardcore fans, i.e. otaku, and the relationship that those fans have with things like K-On! I wrote a longer post about this episode at the time that it came out, diving into the specifics of why and how the episode parodies fandom, which I will link in the description below. It's definitely a strange episode, especially in the way that it seems to play up this fan meeting as a touching moment, even though Mio is being comically victimized the whole time, as if the joke itself is how everyone but Mio is gratified by the whole thing, and Nodoka completely misses the point. Episode 8 has the girls reminiscing about the past while being concerned about the future, and we get some ideas about what each of them plans to do after high school. Once again, this reinforces the feelings that the Light Music Club only has so much time together, since they'll all be taking different paths in the future. This leaves Yui in a particularly precarious position since this club is the only place she's ever been able to do anything with herself, and by the end of the episode, she still has no idea what the future might bring. If there's one thing we know about Yui, it's that she's always been able to hold up miraculously along the way, but this episode leaves us with an almost uneasy feeling about how she's going to make it on her own. Episode 9 feels like it's meant to be some kind of strange one-shot episode that you could watch entirely on its own. Seriously, what's up with the weird-ass Kyoto Animation logo segment at the start? Episode 10 appears to be about Sawa-chan sensei, but I think the purpose is more to give us an idea of what kind of things may lie in store for the future of the main girls. Sawako's old bandmates are trying to get her to perform with them at one of the members' weddings, but being the image-obsessed crazy person that she is, she wants nothing to do with it. In the end, the girls trick her into getting on stage by performing badly and reawaken the musician that lives inside of her, but the real point of this episode is shared more in the images that flash through Sawako's mind while she's on stage and which litter her photo albums back in the club room. Images of a Light Music Club from 8 years ago who were the best of friends back then and seem to stay in communication to this day, getting together for celebrations such as this. A wedding is a weird-ass place for the reunion of a speed metal band performing songs that they wrote in high school. Yui remarks that adults are amazing while she's practicing their music and wonders if she'll be an adult when she grows up. What she's admiring is something implacable about Sawako and her friend Nori. It's something Yui felt when she saw Nori noodling away at Gita, something in the way Nori schemes to bring the band back together and in the way that one of the old bandmates is getting married. My favorite writing about this episode comes from Ghost Lightning, who talks about the days when he carried a guitar around back in high school. At first, when one of his upperclassmen would play his guitar, he wouldn't touch it after they handed it back to him. However, as he got more passionate and confident, he would play his own licks after getting the guitar back, just as Yui does in this scene. The way she starts playing immediately after getting the guitar back makes it feel like she's trying to practice as fast as possible in the hopes of reaching Nori's level. More than ever, Yui seems ready to strive for that ephemeral sense of adulthood. Episode 11 is about it being too damn hot. It's so damn hot, I can't even think. Episode 12 features an incredibly cool portrayal of a summer music festival, and once again, as someone who goes to a lot of concerts, I appreciated this a ton. Seriously, it was so exciting just to see an event like this presented with such accuracy in an animated series that I got totally hyped just based on the concept alone. It was great to watch the girls getting legitimately excited about music, especially Mio, who always seems to be the most passionate about her musicianship in general. The last scene with all the girls laying in the grass listening to the music music wafting from the distance was particularly resonant. A lot of the most memorable moments I've had at big events like festivals and conventions are the moments I spent away from the action, breathing in the atmosphere of the scenario and hanging out with friends. There really is something about hearing music from a distance that can make it every bit as magical in its transience as actually seeing the performance in front of you. Yui's declaration that Hokago Tea Time is better than the other bands is at first baffling, but each of the girls quickly comes to agree with her. No one ever explains what Yui means by this, giving it the air of an unquantifiable feeling which only those who have experienced it can share. Maybe Yui means that performing as a group is more fun than watching others perform, or maybe she really feels that their group puts on better shows. It's left open to interpretation because the bottom line is that we as viewers can't understand what these 5 girls are feeling. I don't even know if the writers could tell us what Yui really meant, and maybe different staff members would have their own interpretations. At this point, these girls have a life of their own, as they have feelings which only they themselves can fully understand, independent of the creators or the audience, and that, I think, is goddamn brilliant. Episode 13 is once again hot. It's also sleepy. I'm too tired to think. This is the point where the opening and ending songs change, so I'd like to make some notes about each. I love Go Go Maniac and Listen, especially the incredibly creative video for the latter, but the second core OP and ED are easily my favorites in the series. No Thank You is by far my favorite song to come from the franchise, with a great video to boot, but the video for Utaoyo Miracle is truly something special to me because it's like a microcosm of everything that makes the series great. It opens with Ritsu turning on a camera, most likely so the girls can film some kind of silly video either for posterity or to use as a music video. Being herself, she of course makes pretty eyes at the camera while Yui does something silly and Azunyan is fixing her hair in the background. After a wonderful transition, we see the girls performing a live show on top of a bunch of desks inside of a classroom, which is a totally awesome concept for a music video, but while the other girls are playing real instruments, Yui doesn't have her guitar and is singing into what looks like a pencil case in lieu of a microphone, which gives this whole scene a playful thematic feel as well as oddly divorcing it from reality. Take note of this little twirl that Yui does. After some great technically accurate playing, we see the girls doing all kinds of random stuff that when shown in sequence flows together almost like a dance. Next, each of them introduces themselves and plays a bit of their instrument, except Yui, who's showing us her guitar as if it were itself a member of the group, and Mio, who's too shy to hold up her own name card. Next, we see Yui describing to the other girls a move she wants to do where they kick out their leg and pull it back, while standing in a row. After a shot of the girls singing, we see them attempting Yui's move. First, Mio messes up, and then Yui, and then with a dramatic reveal, it turns out Mio messed up again, and they all laugh about it. We get more shots of the band performing, running around, and praying to the statue in front of the school. Up next, there's a sequence in which Mugi, Mio, and Ritsu all put a curse on a slice of cake so that when Yui gets ready to eat it, the strawberry falls off the fork. After the stunningly animated shot of Ritsu hitting her cymbals in sequence, we see the girls finally nail the leg thing, and then we cut to the performance again. Once again, Yui performs her move in which she points at the audience in 2 different directions and then twirls, only this time the crowd has caught on and all of them twirl with her. And wouldn't you know it, those are actually the background classmates that we see in each episode. Yui looks elated that everyone played along. After some more shots of the girls having fun, we get into the last stretch of the song where Yui starts singing Daisuki, meaning I love you, 3 times. The first time we see the girls glomping Sawa-chan sensei, then Nodoka-chan, and then after an interesting game of rock paper scissors, Ui and Jun. The lyrics then declare that Yui will sing for you, and we see the girls all singing at the camera before a few more images bring it to a close. So why did I break that down so much? Partly because it happened so fast that a lot of it went over my head until I had watched the video a ton of times, but also because I think this once again speaks to the density and creativity of this series. This opening theme delivers moment after moment of heartwarming, intimate, and funny scenes in the span of seconds, all without any dialogue or explanation. It reminds me of the way the character Eiji Nizuma from Bakuman would always say that a good character needs to be able to move. The girls of K-On! Can move around so much and feel so alive in even the smallest moments that we can understand the relationship and the power behind it in mere seconds. This opening is practically an entire episode of the show squeezed into a minute and a half, and that's why I find myself revisiting it again and again when I want a quick hit of the K-On! Feels. Episode 14 is another one that I don't have much to say about, but before I breeze past it, I want to ensure that I don't come off as glib or dismissal of these episodes in passing. Not every episode of K-On! Moves the characters and plot forward in dramatic ways, but as I said at the beginning of part 1, the narrative of K-On! Is really about the relationship that the viewer forms with the series along the way. Episodes like this, which show us more of the characters and their interactions, are just as important to that relationship as any other. This was actually one of my favorite episodes of the season so far, because it focused on the rare pairing of Ritsu and Mugi, and got a lot of great fish out of water comedy out of it, but I don't think there's anything that I need to explain explain about it. Now let's talk about a perfect K-On! Scene. Halfway through episode 15, there's a scene in which the 4 seniors are running up an inclined slope as part of a mini marathon. Yui is about ready to give up, claiming that this kind of activity is impossible for a liberal arts club. Mio then suggests that they do this the K-On! Way and try running to a rhythm, so they attempt to do so while singing various Hokago Tea Time songs. The comedy comes out of the different ways that they end up failing. It's a very short scene and wouldn't stand out that much, except that it's a scene that is perfectly K-On! What I mean is that this scene could only happen this way with these characters and in this scenario at this particular point in the show. The scene works because the girls are singing their own songs, which we as an audience are familiar with because we've heard them perform those songs at various points throughout the show. It makes sense for all 4 girls to know these songs and their rhythms because they're the ones who wrote them. Other shows would probably handle this joke by having the girls either run to some random song made up for the scene or to the opening theme, which anime characters are always strangely privy to. But in this show, the fact that the tempo of Fua Fua Time is too fast is funny because we already know the song, and immersive because we know why the characters know the song. It's also yet another scene wherein the girls do something that makes sense for all of them to do as a group, yet the humor comes from their individuality. Yui's inability to keep up, or Mugi's inability to sing and run at the same time, or Ritsu telling Yui to replace forgotten lyrics with doo-doo-doo, are all things which uniquely affect those characters, even though the scenario involves all 4 of them. This scene not only shows us how this show can get comedy out of the small differences between characters who are experiencing something in a very similar way, but also couldn't have been as funny if it happened at an earlier point in the show, when the viewer was less familiar with Hokago Tea Time's music. I broke down this scene so much because while I've been talking a lot about the broad strokes of K-On! Story progression, I also wanted to make note of how even the small comedy scenes are affected by the narrative progress of the show, and therefore contribute to the overall sense of progression. Similarly, episode 16 opens up with Azunyan realizing how much the mannerisms of the other girls have rubbed off on her, which is another thing that we better understand through our familiarization with those mannerisms. This is also another big way in which the show perfectly conveys the nature of friendship, at least from my perspective as someone who is very easily influenced by both my friends and by the people I admire in general. To illustrate this, let's look at some lines from part 1 of this very thesis. I'd now like to go into full hipster journalist mode and make up a bunch of phrases in order to define the different kinds of fan service as I see them. This sentence was inspired by the style of one of my favorite video game analysts on YouTube, Mr. B-Tongue, who frequently refers to the things he's about to say as pretentious, hyperbolic, or hipstery in order to show self-awareness of how people might perceive certain parts of his videos. It's a defense mechanism that allows you to do things like make up a bunch of academic-sounding words to try to describe something without having people thinking that you're a stuck-up jackass. That's more of a stylistic trope though, so here's a line directly influenced by a close friend. It's easy to buy into the kayfabe of K-On! For those who don't know this word, kayfabe is a term used in the fandom of professional wrestling to describe the illusion of reality that the storyline adheres to. It's similar to a phrase like in character or in universe, referring to the fictional reality that wrestling is supposed to take place in. I did not know this phrase nor anything about professional wrestling until a few months ago, when my good friend and video producer Drowning in Footwear started making vlogs about the history of pro wrestling. Since then, he's always sending me his favorite wrestling promos and educating me on the lore of the medium, which has for the first time gotten me interested in it. This terminology would not be appearing in my videos if I were not friends with him. Throughout episode 16, Azunyan is confronted with the ways in which she has changed to fit into the rhythm of the Light Music Club, and she starts to worry that she's losing her sense of self. This all culminates into what is secretly an existentialist conversation between Azusa and Yui, and I say secretly because neither character is capable of understanding existentialism to the point that they could have a conversation about it on academic terms, yet what they are attempting to communicate is unmistakably an existentialist idea. Yui basically tries to tell Azunyan that what defines her is not an abstract sense of self, but her actual being, who she is in the moment. It's impossible for Azunyan to not be herself because what herself is exactly what she is. She is not defined by the ephemeral image of herself in her mind, but by a series of objective actions which she is subjectively interpreting. That is to say that while we can make up an idea of who we think we are, that idea is not who we actually are. We are actually an objectively existent thing. None of this is to say that the sense of self is unimportant, as it can definitely affect our actions a lot, but Yui is essentially telling Azunyan that she should accept the thing that she is for what it is, instead of trying to force herself to conform to a rigidly defined sense of being. Now, I'm not saying that this is what the show is trying to communicate, nor that this is what every viewer should get out of this exchange. What I'm really doing is diving into the logic behind the more loosely understood feelings that Yui is trying to convey. I think most people vaguely understand the idea that at the end of the day, things are the way they are regardless of how others perceive them, given the commonality of the phrase, "it is what it is." But just because a character like Yui can't express the deeper existential meaning of that phrase doesn't mean that said meaning is non-existent. It is what it is. Episode 17 starts preparing us for the final stretch of the show as the countdown to the last cultural festival performance begins. We also get our first taste of a series of forthcoming emotionally poignant moments, with Yui writing the song You and I about her sister Ui when she's sick. Even the other characters tear up just reading the lyrics, and you bet I did too. The fact that the lyrical theme of this song is not realizing the importance of something until it's gone only adds to the bitter sensation of knowing that the Light Music Club only has so much time together. Episode 18 then sets up a scenario in which Mio has to play Romeo and Ritsu has to play Juliet in a class play during the upcoming cultural festival. This scenario has come up in anime enough times that it could be considered a light trope, with a great episode of Ranma 1/2 and the entire second half of Hodo Musuko springing to mind immediately. I love the idea that the entire class is basically shipping Mio and Ritsu, and that it pretty much works out since they end up deciding to play the characters by essentially impersonating one another. Worth noting is that in this arc, the background characters all get more lines, and a lot of them are even named. Also, while K-On! Could always have been said to have the light framework of an arc structure, this is the first time that one individual storyline is broken across 2 episodes. Episode 19 mostly serves to deliver on an awesome Romeo and Juliet performance and then begin to seg you into the second day of the cultural festival leading up to the band's last performance. Here we get yet another familiar, friendly bonding experience in the form of an all-nighter in a unique location, which to me is like basically the founding block of friendship itself. At the end, even Sawa-chan manages to make a costume that the girls are actually happy with for once, and with that we move on to the big one. This is quite possibly my favorite episode of anime, period. There's an almost transcendental feeling to it, similar to the ending of Speed Racer or some of the last scenes from Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann. Each long, uninterrupted scene draws the viewer in as we experience the live performance almost in real time, putting us right there in the scene with the audience and the characters. Sound design and direction are masterfully used to create a sensation not unlike what I've felt at some of the best live shows I've been to, or the feeling of actually living out a moment like this with one of my friends. Episode 20 of K-On! Season 2 is the culmination of all of the emotions and events and people which have brought us to this place. It is not a realization of how far the characters have come the way the other episodes were. The characters are well aware of how far they've come. This, my friends, is a celebration. It is 5 girls taking one last opportunity to thank everyone and everything that has made them who they are, and to show off the fruits of that labor. This is the girls giving back to the society that raised them, metaphorically speaking. The episode begins laying into the emotions of the characters and the viewer early on, with the reveal that Sawa-chan sensei has made Hokago Tea Time shirts for pretty much the entire student body. I am not exaggerating that when I watched this episode in order to write this video, I started crying at this moment and did not stop crying for the entire episode. This moment when the girls truly realize how much everyone loves and supports them, and how they might be able to inspire and give something back to the crowd, sets the tone for the entire episode to be one long celebration, not only for every character in the show, but for the audience as well. We get the ultimate treat of getting to watch these characters perform some of their best material yet, at their most unified and technically proficient, with the most emotions propelling them. Rice is a Dish might be the most genius use of music in the entire show, as the lyrics are legitimately hilarious, utilizing the brand of humor that is common to the show, yet it works perfectly as a hype-ass concert piece. Yui's interactions with the audience throughout this song are brilliant and sold me on the entire idea of this concert and its presentation. Yui's extended MC monologues are very simple-minded and repetitive, but the point of them is not to remind the audience of anything, but for reaffirmation. The best way I can explain this is to crib some lines from my favorite poem, More Often Than Sometimes by Shane Koichi-chan. Regardless, there's something beautiful about stating the obvious. All of us do it in the moments when we can't believe it, we have to say it. It's like pinching yourself to make sure you're awake. Take, for example, something as simple as touching someone. We so often say, "You're so soft." And the last person to touch them may have said it for the 28th time, but today I'm number 29. And I'm not saying it for her benefit, I'm saying it for mine. Because there's almost 7 billion people in this world, half of which are men, and when the number of them is 3.5 billion, it's pretty fucking cool that I was number 29. This beauty in stating the obvious is what drives all of Yui's dialogue in this episode, and the audience completely understands where she's coming from. Even though she's silly and makes no sense sometimes, everyone understands that she's trying to communicate a deeper feeling. The experience experience of realizing that there is more to her than herself, that all these people, places, and things have shaped the person that she is today and allowed her to take this place on stage and sing these words to this crowd. You could say that insofar as K-On! Is the story of Yui's life, everything in her life has led up to this moment, exploding here as an image of completion. Yui's speeches are her own loving thesis on the nature of K-On! Their performance ends with You and I, a song about not wanting to lose the precious thing that you've found, and it's from there that we fade away into one of the most heartbreaking sequences ever put to animation. As the girls sit together, basking in the afterglow of a feeling that none of them has the words to qualify, the seniors finally lose their shit. They don't want this to be the end. How could they? How could you sit down and realize that you've just had the best experience of your life and that you will never have that exact experience again? Talk to anyone who has met their friends at a convention about post-con depression and they'll probably tell you about a scene similar to this. These girls are coming face to face with transience and finality, and to accept something like that is akin to accepting death. This scene speaks directly to the human experience, to the nature of living and passing on to new stages of life. It's harsh, it's real, it's intimate. The first time I saw this scene, the moment that Ritsu said lycopene, I completely and utterly lost my shit. That this line, this inside joke spawned randomly one night on a school field trip would now be here in this most emotional moment where these characters are at once at their lowest and highest point blows my fucking mind. This is the definition of friendship. This one scene about the implacable duality of transient experiences as expressed in the tears of 5 high school girls at the moment that they realized that their childhood was over is among the most resonant things I have witnessed in art. Episode 21 pushes us into the twilight days of the Light Music Club. It occurs to me that in part 1 of this video I used poor phrasing when I said that K-On! Was the story of Hokago Tea Time the people rather than the band. What seems obvious now that I think about it is that this is the story of the Light Music Club as an entity. It begins with the club's formation and will eventually end with its dissolution. But what's interesting about this last stretch of episodes is that it's almost like this is the club post Hokago Tea Time. Not to say that they stopped playing or caring about music or that they stopped being a band together, but the arc of their musicianship and what it brought into their lives is essentially complete. As of their last performance, they've become the best that they'll ever be as a band. Now we are essentially moving on to focus on how they may still change as people while being members of this club. This episode is deliberately slow and not highly consequential in contrast with the previous one. Its most important moment comes at the end when Mio decides that she wants to try to go to the same university as the other girls, which gives us the first hints that this group of friends will indeed survive the death of their club, even if things change from here on out. I do wonder about whether or not Mio is wise to deliberately hamstring her potential college choices by following Ritsu and Yui, though you could make the case that in terms of her overall growth as a person, these friends are every bit as important as any qualifications she might get from school. Mio has never been happier, more fulfilled, or more robust as a person than she is with these friends, so maybe this will result in the best possible version of Mio. Also during this arc, we begin to focus more on Azusa's feelings as she watches the others prepare to leave her behind. Episode 22 is when it finally sinks in that the other girls are going to graduate, and watching Azusa's reaction fills me with a sense of helplessness. Graduation has been used time and again in anime to mark the passage of youth into adulthood, because it's a nearly universal experience that everyone has in realizing that a part of their life is over, that whatever the future may hold, there is no going back to the past. And like I said before, accepting that finality is akin to accepting death. Azusa must live out these next few weeks knowing that this is the last of the time that she has in the Light Music Club with these members, meaning that this feeling is going to end. As an aside, I'd like to break down the first and most prominently used song that the Light Music Club wrote, Fua Fua Time. See, the Japanese language, or at least the language as presented by anime, has a funny tendency to describe sensations and emotions by utilizing sound effects. There are commonly used verbal sound effects for just about anything you can think of in Japanese, and these have a tendency to get used a lot in a metaphorical context. For instance, the sound effect for a heartbeat, which is doki doki, is commonly used to describe feelings of love or adrenaline or pretty much anything that would make your heartbeat quicken, even if only metaphorically. Fua Fua is an interesting sound effect because it's basically the sound of fluffiness. It's also the sound of yawning and of floating, and what all of these things have in common is that it's weird to even assign a sound to them. Fua Fua is really more describing a feeling that you get from certain things more than it is an actual sound that those things make. Fluffiness and floatiness don't actually make noises, but in trying to describe the sound that those might make if they did, you convey the kind of feeling that those sensations have. Fua Fua time is usually translated as light and fluffy time, which I think is a great translation, but when you think about it, what exactly is a light light and fluffy time. Or if we incorporated the meaning of floating in there, a fluffy floating time. To me, it speaks of transience and of an implacable feeling. The meaning of the time these girls spend together isn't something that can be easily defined in words, but is better expressed in sensation. When I think of the sensation of floating, I think of something dreamlike, ethereal, and ultimately temporary. To me, a fua time is a time that's important, but you're not sure why. A time that feels nice, but passes by before you even realize it's happening. A thing that you can never get back, and which you never fully understood to begin with. The chord progression of this song is incredibly nostalgic sounding, and puts me in a reminiscent state of mind whenever I hear it. It reminds me of how Idea Channel once compared nostalgia to the sensation of ambivalence, or the feeling of being happy and sad at the same time. That's what this last stretch of K-On! Is. It's an ambivalent charge towards a future where the only certainty is that things are going to change, and in that sense, it is a fua time. At the start of episode 23, Shiraishi Minoru's voice is totally coming out of Yui's TV. Lucky Star fans should appreciate why I love this. Also, something about this line when Yui is drawing a game board and Ritsu asks, "Where's the goal?" and Yui says, "There's no room to draw one," and Ritsu says, "Then it's unplayable," reminded me of like Waiting for Godot or something. I'm pretty sure that was not intentional though. This episode screws the nostalgia in deeper, as the seniors spend all day dicking around at school since they don't technically have to be there. It was pretty cool first watching this show in 2010, a year after I graduated high school, because it reminded me of my own last few weeks as a senior. My school wasn't nearly so loose about letting kids wander around, but we did have things like senior privileges, where if your lunch period was scheduled last, you could just leave. During the end of the year exams, I'd only show up for the tests, and for the last month or so, most teachers barely bothered assigning anything. I remember feeling like I was already done with school and was just hanging around in the building to tie up a few loose ends before I went on my way, not unlike what the girls are doing here. Later in the episode, the girls decide to record a cassette of all their music to leave in the club room, and while we don't see any of the performances, we do get to hear some of the funny things that end up on the tape in between. It so happens that one of the K-On! CDs has a bonus disc which contains the entire tape recorded in this episode, including all the in-between stuff seen in the episode, as well as a bunch of extras. It's even recorded to sound like it's playing from a cassette and includes all of the band's known songs. If you ever want to step on a fucking landmine of feels, I highly recommend hunting down and listening to this album. Episode 24 is the finale, and chronologically the end of the series, though there are still 2 more extra episodes, an OVA, and a movie ahead. The seniors finally graduate, but not without giving their big send-off to the important people that they'll be leaving behind, namely Sawa-chan sensei and Azunyan. Watching Sawa-chan throughout the season has been kind of interesting because she seems to play a much smaller role than she did in season 1, yet develops a lot more as a character in the background. Sawa-chan's arc is seen in the way that running her class slowly humbles her. We watch her become more honest with her students, and as her defenses are broken down thanks to the Light Music Club bringing out her other sides and the other students learning about them, she eventually recognizes that her students will love her even more if she's true to herself, and she lets the facade slip more often. She also becomes less selfish as the series goes, measuring her success more in her ability to make her students happy and praise her than in getting her way with them. In the last stretch of episodes, Sawa-chan makes lots of good decisions for her students, from the Hokago Tea Time t-shirts to not waking them up for gratification after the show, and she is paid back in the kindness of her first graduating class in a big way during the finale. Meanwhile, Azunyan tries to put on a brave face and send the seniors off with a smile, but she finally breaks down and begs them not to go. The girls do the best thing they could to keep that smile intact by performing a song that they wrote for her, very literally about how they'll always love her and how graduation is not the end of their friendship. Try not to tear up during this song, I dare you. It's even more powerful if you've seen the K-On! Movie too, which largely deals with the characters trying to write this very song. Episode 25 takes place after episode 21 and is a silly side story of the girls trying to put together a recruitment video for the next year's Light Music Club. I imagine that this and the next episode were structured this way so that episodes 20 through 24 could have one consistent tone and the theme of the girls graduating high school without breaking up the feelings too much with silly side stories, which I think was a great decision. I kind of wonder if the idea for the recruitment video is what inspired the video for Utaoyo Miracle as well. Episode 26 is set after episode 23 and mostly serves as another silly side story, but this time with an emotional final scene. We get our first hints at what the future of the Light Music Club itself might be, as the seniors find out that Azunyan, Jun, and Ui are planning to perform at the freshman welcoming ceremony next year. Watching the girls run through the school to the sound of the juniors' music offers not only a sense of finality for the seniors' place place in the club, but also a sign that for the underclassmen, a brand new Fua time is just beginning. Thus, the circle of life is complete for the Light Music Club. The Keion Keikaku OVA takes us back to the summertime shortly after episode 13 and provides the setup for the girls to take a trip to England in the film. I think this OVA probably partially existed so that the film wouldn't have to do as much setup at the beginning, and so that they could flesh out the entertaining prospect of the girls trying to get passports. Keion the movie could almost be considered a condensed version of season 2, in terms of the story beats that it hits and the overall feeling it conveys. I wonder if the idea was exactly that, to provide a hit of the same feels that the show delivers, but in a cinematic package with all of the crazy production values and more condensed runtime that implies. This film really encapsulates all of the best things about the series, from the fun tea times, to the even more fun group trips, to the emotionally resonant live performances, and the ultimate finality of the girls graduating and leaving Azusa behind. The main plot of the film is about the seniors trying to create something for Azunyan and eventually composing the song that they played for her in episode 24, which is duplicated again in the film. The scene is more resonant this time thanks to receiving so much focus and coming at the end of a film that so easily shows off all of the best things about the show while feeling like a cohesive story. It's obvious, even if you've never been, that the staff for this film spent some time in London to recreate it with accuracy, and my aforementioned friend Gibbon-Take said that he was excited to see places that he passes by on an everyday basis as someone who lives there. This film really takes the attention to detail, overall visual and sound design, and quality of humor to the next level, making it in many ways the most densely complete package of what Keion is capable of. Back in part 1 of this post, I continuously reiterated the idea that Keion is a show that gets better the more of it you watch, and that the narrative itself is the relationship which the viewer develops with the series. While the last arc of season 2 is more emotionally resonant than anything that came before, I think that a lot of what made this season great was in all of those episodes that I didn't have much to say about. The first season of Keion more consistently progressed the storyline, but it was so condensed that the characters never really got a chance to breathe and to grow on me as people, which is why when I watched that season the first time, I thought it was a good show that I didn't really care much about. It was only through getting a sense of the lives of these characters and all of the things that they experienced together that I came to truly care about them, which not only made those last scenes so resonant to begin with, but also enhanced my feelings for the first season in turn. Rewatching season 1 is in many ways a treat. It's almost shocking to start up the first episode and realize that the characters were almost completely different people back then. Their change had been so gradual that only in looking back is its severity truly apparent, and it's also much easier to become invested in those early episodes when I already know why I love these characters and who they are. I can feel this in the film as well, how it sort of serves to reiterate the best things about season 2, but is only so resonant because I've already seen season 2. Watching the movie is like getting a killer bonus version. The more deeply you care about these characters, the more you'll end up cherishing every moment you have with them, which is why the series gets better the more of it you watch. And that about wraps up my feelings on Keion as a whole. It's worth mentioning that the manga actually continues for a little while after the point where the anime ended, but was split into 2 different series running in 2 different magazines, each lasting 1 volume. One shows the older girls entering college and joining the Light Music Club there, while the other shows the younger girls, now seniors, continuing the club in high school and bringing on new members. While it is nice to know a little bit about where the characters went after the series ended, I personally find the manga pretty difficult to read, as it contains little of what made the anime great. To put into perspective just how different the anime and manga are, the first episode of the anime was adapted from just the first 10 pages of the manga, and the second episode is just from the next 9. The manga doesn't have nearly the level of characterization, feels, or attention to detail that the show does, and much more gives the impression of being the kind of moe-driven, lightly fanservice-y series that people at first accused of the anime of being. Also worth mentioning is the insane amount of musical releases to come from this series. You can easily download several gigabytes of just Keion music, from themed albums like the one recreating the tape that I mentioned before, to singles of the openings and ending themes and other songs performed by the voice actresses, to soundtracks, to live concerts of the show's music, etc. For fans of the show and its music, I definitely recommend looking into some of this stuff, as there's a ton of worthwhile finds. I loved hearing the full versions of Death Devil's songs, for instance, or the hyper-energetic live shows. That's all I have to say, and I hope you enjoyed watching these videos even a fraction as much as I enjoyed writing them. Be sure and hang around my channel for more content like this in the pipeline, and if you want to make sure I can keep making these kinds of videos, consider supporting me via Patreon or PayPal by following the links below. See ya in the next one.